Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's funny that, like, even within religious circles, and my perspective is mostly the church, but one of the things that we're taught is to serve. It is shocking to a lot of people within the church or within, these other groups where that's one of these things that we're taught to do. That's a core tenet of who we are supposed to be. And yet it is shocking because we have been so inundated with this culture of individualism and this culture of what can I get out of it, to the point where, you even think about, the buildup of some of these TV ministries and things that are all about what can I get? How, if you give me this is what I promise you God is going to give you. Well, I mean, that's selfishness, and that's not what we're about. And that's not what we should be about as human beings. I mean, and that's what, I look at when I even think back to, even outside of the Christian ethic, just looking at the greats of philosophy, the best philosophy is all about how we come around together, and obviously we can find philosophers that are going to be just as selfish as the rest of everybody. But in the end, the best of it is always looking and seeing, how do we create what's best, not only for me, but for my entire community. And that is what we are striving for. And honestly, I think a lot of times at the beginning, I think even some of these tech companies that we think of maybe have caused some of this expansion of this idea. You look back to what they were kind of supposed to be at the beginning, and it seemed like they were trying to build something out that was for building community, but it ended up being more about pulling it apart.
Yeah, that's been the consequence, I think, in some cases. And that brings up sort of an interesting point a previous guest had made, who's there's this really interesting project called Urbit, where they're trying to build this completely new networked computing paradigm that it's like a new internet, basically, is the way I would put it. And he had a pretty compelling argument or a case to make that a lot of the issues that we face, where the temptation is to point fingers at people or companies or anything else, are in fact a consequence of architecture, and perhaps not really. It's sort of very difficult to see prospectively, but now in retrospect, we see that there were some fundamental flaws, and really, I mean, how personal computing was designed. But I do think too, there is that cultural component. These two things are somewhat sort of linked.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah. So on the local engagement piece, I mean, maybe it's as easy as just going around starting to talk to your neighbors, which just requires a little bit of discipline and planning.
A lot of it.
I think it does require discipline and planning. It's a lot easier to get the feeling of engagement or the virtual experience of political engagement, let's say, by searching for something that's going to get you all fired up on Twitter.
Right.
That kind of shallow experience, because it's more proximal, but ultimately less satisfying, is going to prevent a lot of people from going out and meeting their neighbors, which that's
Well, I think
less
interesting there is, a lot of times we want to, wherever somebody is on the political spectrum, you want to make whoever's on the other side an enemy. And that's kind of what we've built up over like the last maybe 25, 30 years. It's kind of built, I would say, there's always been some of that. Like people want to say, oh, let's go back to the way things were. Well, I mean, Jefferson and Adams were really ugly to each other. I mean, we had, you can go back to the beginning and see some really terrible things that were done and said. But you think about, what's happened in the last 25, 30 years, really starting with the Clinton administration and moving on forward. And we've really pulled apart when it comes to politics. But what's interesting is, and you hit on this, but when we think about it, I was talking about, those ways that we just get into whatever's being said on Twitter, whatever's being said on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and it's just firing us up, and we're like, yeah, get them, and whatever how you're going into that. But when you sit down and talk with somebody, it's amazing how often I will sit down and talk with somebody who ultimately, if I looked at what they were posting online, I would think that we fundamentally disagree on most things. But when you sit down and have a conversation and you begin to understand why they believe what they believe, why they may vote differently than you or support a candidate that you don't support, you start to find out not only do you have more in common, but you begin to understand why they support that candidate. And maybe those reasons aren't as nefarious as you thought that they were. And that's hard to understand sometimes, because a lot of us these days, we've become tribal when it comes to politics. We hold on to that really, really strongly. And so we have to be willing at times to sit down and talk to that neighbor, sit down and talk to that friend, sit down and talk to that family member who disagrees with us, and find where the common ground is and find out those things that we can work together on. What is it that we do agree on? What is it that we want to fight for together? And begin to look and say, yeah, man, I really disagree with you on this issue, but we do agree on this other, and we can come together and work together on those things. But it does take some intentionality. It, like you said, if you're going to talk to your neighbor, you're going to have to be intentional about it. You're going to have to be thinking, okay, how do I do this? Well, I'm going to throw a barbecue in my backyard, and I'm going to go, so I live on a cul-de-sac. So I might look and say, I'm going to throw a barbecue and I'm going to go knock on everybody's door in the cul-de-sac and say, if you want to, we're going to watch the Eagles game and eat next Sunday. So come on and join us for that. Or actually this Sunday, and then next is on Monday. But I've got the Eagles schedule on my mind. But you're thinking through that, but you're going to have to be intentional about it. You're going to have to think, I want to build these relationships, and I'm going to have to be the one that's going to start this. And I don't think it used to be such a difficult thing because everybody was expecting to. You think, I think you hit it right when you said the 60s, because I think if you go back to the 50s, we lived in what I would look at as a front porch culture, where you were out on the front porch, you were talking to your neighbors, you knew what was going on, you were interested in what was happening with your neighbors' kids and all this, and they were all playing together and running around the neighborhood and all of these things. And we've moved from that, I think from the 60s on forward, to a backyard culture where we've built these privacy fences and we've built these decks. And instead of being out front where we're open with everybody, we've moved into a place culturally where we're blocking ourselves off from one another. And we're wary of what is happening in the house next door instead of looking and saying and inviting those people into our lives.
That makes a ton of sense. And funny resonance with when I said consequences downstream of architecture. I was talking about computer architecture, but you're literally describing the consequences of real world actual architecture. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, okay. Why should somebody care about building relationships with their neighbors when they can just get an unending stream of, engagement?
I think because those relationships are so much more real. And I think you can build real relationships online. I mean, I've got a group of guys that I play Dungeons and Dragons with every week. And we usually play on Sunday, but if several of us have some things, we'll move it. Like we ended up playing last night instead of Sunday. But I spend 4 hours a week with this group of people. And we have now for, come and go with some different folks we have for about 3.5, 4 years. We've gotten to know each other really, really well. But it is this, it's like what we're doing now. It's this video relationship. We'll play games. We'll sit and talk to each other. We're on Discord talking with each other. Those relationships are more real than the relationships I have with people I've never met on Twitter. But even those relationships aren't as real as the ones that I have with people that are coming into my home and sharing a meal and sitting down and having conversation. And the way I look at it is I have a very different relationship with the people in my church that I've sat down and had coffee with, that I've sat down and had a meal with, that have been in a small group with me where we've been studying scripture together, studying a book together, whatever it is, than I do with the people that just hear me on a Sunday morning that all I've ever said is hello to, because, you know, we haven't reached out to each other and built a stronger relationship. And I look at that like the relationship with people on Twitter. There are people that I've met on Twitter, and now I have a stronger relationship with them. But I mean, there's people that, you know, I've interacted with for years online, but all we've done is tweet at each other. I don't have a relationship. I don't have a real relationship with them, and I might learn from them. Like I've got some people that I would almost look at as like digital mentors, in the sense that I've learned a whole lot from them, and I've read what they've said, and I've watched them, but they don't know me and I don't know them. And I think we've got this false equivalency of, we think that we know people because we're interacting with them on Facebook or we're interacting with them on Twitter. But just think about what it would, you know, how much stronger relationship you can have with the person that you're standing in their yard and letting them borrow your lawnmower. Then, you know, and you're having a real conversation about what's going on within your kid's school system, or what's going on with, you know, the new restaurant that's moved in down the street. These are things that actually affect our everyday lives. And most of the stuff that we're arguing about online doesn't do that. And so I think there are some great things about what we can do to build relationships online. I've walked with some of my friends online through some very difficult situations and kind of been a counselor in that. But those are relationships that are built more like those offline relationships and are very rare from what I see. But there's just something about having that in real life conversation with somebody. It's like you and I were talking the other day and saying, you know, we live about an hour away from each other. We actually need to sit down and have lunch, because we've been talking a lot like this, but there's something about sitting down with somebody and spending time with them that actually will make this relationship better, because we've actually met in person. And so I just think through all of these different things. And the other thing that comes down to it is I really can serve and I really can help the neighbor who is a block over from me or across the street. Whereas all I can do is sort of talk at the person who is following me on Twitter. And you can find some ways, and you can share helpful information, and you can do these kinds of things, but it's just not the same. I think strong relationships can be built online. I mean, part of the reason that I love what Virgil's does is allowing children like my son to build strong relationships, because they're meeting weekly with the same group of people, and they're meeting, you know, face to face to an extent, even if it's in a virtual way. And that's a lot more real than the conversations that he's having with somebody on Discord or on Reddit or whatever. And, but it's still not quite the same as sitting down with a group of people and being able to interact with somebody, being able to say, oh, this, you know, let's say you've got neighbors that need a babysitter this week, and you can say, oh, well, we don't have anything that we're doing Friday. We can watch your kids. And then they're saying, okay, well, the next time that you need a babysitter, we'll watch your kids. And you start to build this relationship. I remember my aunt and uncle, they lived in the DC suburbs in like the 80s and 90s. And I remember one time going up there, and they just had this circle of parents within their neighborhood that would share babysitting duties with each other. So they were never having to spend, you know, I mean, whatever it was at that point, you know, $7, $8, $10 an hour for a babysitter, because they were sharing with each other what they had, their time. And so I think that's really a lot of what it comes down to is it's really hard to serve and to share with other people when it's a completely virtual experience. Whereas when you build a relationship with people in the real world, you can do those things. You can actually take care of the people around you.
So, I mean, it sounds like these different digital media, which there's quite a variety. They maybe have their place, but ultimately it's not a substitute
No.
for reality. And in fact, maybe best case scenario can act really as a stepping stone or some kind of, steps on the bridge back to reality. Like we like to say, if you find somebody who you maybe wouldn't have encountered in reality, and you can invite them to have a more intimate relationship by meeting up, that could be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And I can speak to that just in the sense of what it looked like for the church during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
We went for a while where we were fully virtual. And I was actually supposed to move up here in April of 2020. My first Sunday at the church that I serve in now was supposed to be Easter Sunday. And I had come up here in February to meet the people, and they voted me in and all of these things that came along. And then I had several things that I was doing in the meantime, trying to, tie up some loose ends and do some things before I was coming up here. And then the pandemic hit. And the person who was the interim pastor here had already taken another position because he knew I was supposed to come up here. So there was essentially nobody here. So we started sharing the church services that we were doing in Louisiana with the church up here and sharing responsibilities. And I was trying to pastor a church that was 19 hours away. And you begin to look and see what it is to be virtual and what it is to be in reality. And I've talked to so many people, we still stream our services every Sunday. We weren't doing that before the pandemic, and that can be an okay substitute when you can't come in, but it is not the same thing as a group of people actually gathering together to learn, to take care of one another, to worship together. And I mean, I think it's even more true with you coming from the Catholic tradition, because you literally can't do, unless the priest comes to your house, you can't do the Eucharist at home. And that's the center point of the Catholic Mass. Whereas the center point of, the Baptist service is the message. And you can kind of do that. It's not the same thing as being in the room. But how many people that I talked to that have said that, the virtual service is no substitute to the real thing, but it can be used to bring people into the real thing. We had several people during that time that actually started becoming a part of our fellowship by joining us on Facebook or joining us on YouTube. And then when they felt comfortable coming in and gathering with a group of people again, came in and become integral parts of the community. But yeah, it's not the same thing. You cannot build the same kind of relationships that you can in the real world, but it can be an open door to that, to where you can start to find people that you have interest with. I mean, that's, one of the people that I met with this D&D group. I've invited him and his wife several times and said, look, you keep being interested in all this stuff that Jennifer and I are doing, my wife and I are doing in New York. And I said, well, you just need to come and spend a week with us and we'll take you up there. We'll go and do those things. And so there is this opportunity to build relationships from that. But I think that they can only be so deep if they stop in the virtual world.
Makes a ton of sense. I have a suspicion that there is a in some ways large, but also not immediately obvious error that I think people commit in thinking that the virtual experiences or the digital experiences are substitutes for the real experience, which makes sense. I mean, especially as digital media becomes more compelling, you've got virtual reality, you've got all kinds of crazy personalized experiences with AI and everything else. If you forget that the highest quality, experience that you're going to get is in reality,
right?
And it's very easy to get stuck in this imaginal world where accessibility is always going to sort of be superior versus the accessibility, sort of the options that you have in the real world. If that kind of makes sense. And so, if you forget to come back to reality,
Yep.
then something's going to start to feel like something's kind of off.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I think that's being felt in a lot of ways, across the US right now.
Well, and I think that's, and I think that people are starting to kind of wake up from that a little bit. I think about, so yesterday was the big fall Apple announcement where, they said, here we've got 4 new iPhones and we've got 3 new Apple Watches and we've got this new iOS and that they had unveiled back in the spring, but it's going to be out this week. And here's everything that we've got for you. And it hasn't been that long to where I would have built my day around that Apple announcement. And I would have been at my computer or at the TV with the computer streaming it to the television, watching whatever Steve Jobs was giving me, or in more recent years, whatever it was that Tim Cook was showing me that day. And, I look at it now and there are a lot of reasons that come into it, but I knew it was happening, but I didn't think about it at all yesterday until I was, essentially, I look at it as reading the newspaper in the evening. I was going through my couple of news apps, looking at different things. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about the Apple announcement today. And I think some of that is the iterations aren't as big as they used to be. So there isn't anything as amazing being done as it was. So I think that's part of what it is. But I think some of it is exactly what you said, is I'm not living in that virtual space as much as I was. So I'm not worried as much about what that new thing can do as much as I was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I can do without it. Like it wasn't that long ago that I would be thinking right now, what do I need to do to trade in the iPhone that I have so I can make sure that I've got the new one without spending way too much money on buying it, flat out. And so I think that a lot of us are starting to kind of wake up from this digital utopia that we thought was going to come. And some of it is that it just hasn't. And some of it is that we're realizing what we've lost with so much focus on what's going on online.
Or that, I think that's right. I get a sense that people are waking up to that a bit. Although not everyone.
No, everyone.
Yeah, not everyone, but it's, ultimately it's, all the digital experiences, I think they're kind of asymptotic in that sense. I mean, like whatever virtual experience you're trying to give somebody, it might be more accessible. It's closer to you. It's going to give you a little taste of the thing that you think you want.
Yep.
But it's never quite as good as a real thing.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, it's like there's a guy named Russell Moore. You may have heard of him. He was a big guy with the SBC, kind of walked away from it because of some attacks, because of some political views and stuff, but I won't go into there. But this was a guy that I really respected. I read a lot of his books. I followed him on Twitter and had heard him speak several times. And I happened to be coming back from a conference and I stepped into a Barnes & Noble and had maybe somewhere between a 5 and 10 minute conversation with him. Just thanking him for his influence and talking to him about books. We both had stacks of books in our hands and, talking about what we were buying and reading and these kind of things. And I don't know, maybe a month, 6 weeks after I had that conversation, I got a handwritten note from him. This is a guy that was, had lots of stuff going on, but took the time to find out, to remember me, find out the name of the church that I served in, find that address, and write me a note thanking me for that conversation. And like, I still have that because that meant so much more to me than any time that I've been retweeted or some, influential person has commented on something that I've said, because there was this physical, not only the real world interaction, but this then continuation of that real world interaction of, he could have sent me an email. He could have sent me a DM, and that wouldn't have meant near as much as that like 2 sentence note on a note card that was sent. And I've looked at that so often, and I had a friend of mine, and I've tried to do this several times, and my ADD gets in the way, but I've got a friend of mine who every week writes somebody a handwritten note, letter, and mails it out. And I think that's such an amazing thing, because I've seen how much at times with different people that has meant to me, because there's just something different about having something that's real, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can smell, that is different than just an email. Because an email is, you might spend, that email might be 10 times longer, but it doesn't feel as intimate as that handwritten note that you've got, that hand typed note that you've got, whatever it is. And so there's just something about that connection that we have as people, that we need that real world interaction in order to, build out relationships. Like I even think, we'll probably talk way too much about my D&D group, but these guys I play with every week, like last year we decided to do a, Secret Santa thing. And we had before, with a different group of this same group, as people have come and gone, we had one of these guys made everybody dice rolling trays at one point. And there's something like just exchanging gifts and having real world things that we can put our hands on that were given to us by those people, that connects you in a much stronger way, because that person took some time to think about that, and they wrapped it up, and they did this stuff, and all of these things that come into that, and it's real. And I think that's virtual is great. There's a lot that we can get from it. Digital is great. There's a lot that we can get from it. You and I have been talking a lot about Midjourney. I think this AI art thing is fantastic, especially as somebody who cannot do visual art very well. But it's still not the same as the artwork that I have on my wall, that I can go and I can see the brushstrokes that somebody made. I can see the history of it. We've got 4 panels that I bought. I think it was for the second Christmas after Jennifer and I got married. And it is Jesus and Peter, and then we're not sure who the other 2 saints are. I usually say that it's Patrick and I know it's Jesus and Mary, and I say the other 2 are Patrick and Peter. And those were hanging in our apartment and went through Katrina. And it completely changed those works of art. And I had put some pictures up of them online right after that happened and everything. And the artist actually said, if you want to bring them to my studio, I'll redo them. I'll fix them for you. But I looked at it and said, I don't want those to be fixed. These tell a grander story than they ever did, because of what they went through and what that tells about us now. And those pictures of those that are online are still good. I took decent pictures of those, but it is not the same thing as standing in front of them and being able to see, where it used to be this thick paint there, and now it's just a patina of what once was. And you can see where, they were underwater and in the nasty water of the Pontchartrain and everything that goes into that. And just other works of art that we have that we've picked up at different times. I love these artworks that I have by unknown artists that will never be worth, tens of thousands of dollars more than any kind of print that I could put on the wall of the greatest artists who have ever lived, because there's some reality to it. It is more real. And so as beautiful as the things I can make Midjourney do and the things that I've seen you make Midjourney do, it's not the same as working with an artist and saying, here's the vision that I've got, and seeing them take that and turn it into something, bringing their vision into what you have brought up. It's cool. I think it's amazing. I think it will do some great things, but it's still not quite the same thing as having a real live person make that.
Yeah, perhaps it's meaningful because it is real.
Yeah, I think so.
That's sort of, what the 3 the sort of the Western traditions, the three things that we always kind of look to are the good, the beautiful, and the true.
Right.
And those are just seem to be inherent characteristics of reality itself. So things that are good, beautiful, and true in the virtual world, they can approximate that, but it's always going to be, it's going to be imaginal. It's somehow still untethered from reality.
Right. I mean, I think you think of like the Platonic ideal, and that's never going to be the digital version of that thing.
Right.
You know, it's just not. It's because it's not real. It doesn't have what you just mentioned there. I mean, it's not, it can approximate it. It can get really, really close, but it's not going to be, now I want to put Platonic ideal into Midjourney and see what it comes up.
Midjourney and see what happens.